Good morning, everyone, and welcome back. It's time to go live with Dark Room live stream. And on behalf of Dark Media and Light Collective, I'd like to welcome you to our very first keynote of Dark Room live stream 2020. Durham Marenghi started his career in the theatre, but then developed it, traveling the world, flighting all kinds of shows and events. And he's going to give us an insight into the greatest of them today. During the lockdown in the UK, Durham also started a digest of his over the years. And I've got to say, in the early days of lockdown, they really kept me going. They were fantastic, really fascinating, really good read, funny, moving, and inspiring. And I'm sure the presentation he's going to share with us today will be exactly the same and just as good. So without further ado, I'm the man himself and ask Durham to kick off today's show. Durham, over to you.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome to my presentation, whereby I will examine the process of creating theatrical lighting for stadium events, specifically the greatest show on earth, the Olympic ceremonies. So let me begin with the Winter Olympics opening and closing ceremonies in Turin in 2006. In December 2002, I received an email from an executive of Filmmaster in Italy inviting me to join their team to pitch for the Turin Games. The lighting had to encompass the following elements of the event. It had to illuminate a cast of thousands on a massive stage the size of a football pitch, world-renowned acts on a performance stage larger than most rock shows, a stadium full of interacting audience, and illuminate the sky above to make the event visible on the Turin nightscape. The design had to achieve all this in February in a venue close to the mountains where football matches were often cancelled as the players could not see the ball due to fog. The event also had to be lit to a high-definition broadcast standard to be viewed by 2 billion people worldwide. So firstly, I needed to establish exactly on what control system we would program our lighting rig of over 24,000 channels of DMX. So fundamental to this achievement was UK programmer Ross Williams, who designed the control system and its distribution around the stadium. Ross is seen here with Mark Payne, Pryderi Vascoville, and Emiliano Morgia, who each ran a segment of the rig on their Hog2 platforms. With a daylight environment, such a large rig and weather concerns, there was no other choice than to utilise a virtual programming system. And long-time personal favourites Cast Lighting of Canada supplied 4 WYSIWYG systems to connect the desks to our virtual CAD PCs. I then spent 2 weeks modelling the set design and stadium in 3D, and to complete the virtual design, I had to finalise my choice of lighting equipment from the real world. But first, where to hang the lights? The stadium was being modernised and the building was to include a new roof. But at this stage, the engineers would not commit to the eventual weight-carrying ability of the structure. Also, snow loading was a significant factor in winter in Turin. We needed an independent solution, so I sat down with set designer Mark Fisher to develop a lighting tower placement and design that could be integrated into the set architecture and be as unobtrusive as physically possible, while still providing me with reasonable lighting positions for my equipment. At one end of the stadium, we had our performance stage with gold-painted truss uprights supporting Mark's impressive roof design for the massive theatrical Sipario curtain to be featured with Luciano Pavarotti in the opening ceremony finale. At the opposite end of the field, similar truss uprights supported the innovative moving ring structure that would form the Olympic symbol prior to the athletes' parade. And we decided to extend this motif by creating 4 ground-supported trusses in the 4 corners of the field. The 6 ski ramp entrance ramps of the stage design were delineated by exterior LED fixtures, both to light the ramp surfaces and the hundreds of performers who would be upon them. So mindful of the stadium stories of cancelled football matches due to fog, I was keen to place a significant percentage of the rig as close to the central performance forestage as possible. To this end, we integrated a technical trough into the set design around all the edges of the forestage and its central mosh pit. The mosh pit was a feature designed both as a platform for synchronized choreography of legs, arms, and light sticks waved through a split elasticated skin, and to place the seating of the athletes upon their entrance as close to the Sipario performance stage as possible. So this arrangement allowed artists to perform in close proximity to an audience, and not only to those sat hundreds of feet away in the stadium stands, thus reflecting the late great Mark Fisher's complete understanding of concert environments. Now, historically, these events have been lit with a multitude of lighting sources from every available position around the stadium, thus producing a very even lighting coverage, but not providing defined key lighting for TV, other than follow spots for a very limited number of performers. What I wanted to achieve was effective key lighting and coloured shadow to define the features of large groups of performers, hence the placement of the 4 towers at 90 degrees to the centre stage point, just as we would in the more intimate environment of a theatre in the round. The Sipario stage also had over 100 pars mounted on side booms for general stage illumination and cross-lighting of the many aerial performers featured during the events, including the beautiful Dove of Peace formation on our climbing net. The stadium audience will be wearing white, actually TV grey smocks, so we needed to illuminate them for background shots and for close-ups during applause and crowd interaction. So one of the ways that HDTV impacted our work as lighting designers is the clarity of the background. With standard definition, camera shots of crowds around the performance could be treated as no more than animated colour blocks, the wallpaper, if you like, of the picture composition. However, the viewing audience can now make out the details of the background much more clearly. And as the human eye is drawn to faces, it is our responsibility to light them in a more flattering manner than previously required. So the opening ceremony was quite unusual in theatrical terms in that each of the artistic segments had their own creative directors, choreographers and costume designers. So this impacted our work with the volume of information we had to absorb and the number of meetings we had to attend. Parallel to this, we had to be attentive to the closing ceremony creative process to ensure that we knew exactly what to expect in the 2 short weeks that we had to create that event with yet another director after the opening ceremony was history. So each of the opening artistic segments was very different in terms of style and content. So the first step was to sit down with our creative team and establish the overall geography of the lighting journey that we'll be making during the evening. We decided on 2 main complementary colours for each sequence to delineate between the differing scenes and to create continuity for the multiple camera coverage so that each segment had a recognisable look from wherever in the stadium it was viewed. It's important to me in multi-camera shoots that when the TV director cuts from one shot to another, the audience has a clear understanding of what is happening and where they are viewing it from. If we light everything in multiple colours, each shot can look so different that in the extreme, the coverage looks as though it's coming from multiple venues. A biochromatic approach helps this understanding of where and what we are viewing and is an important role for lighting on this style of event. This simple approach is also represented in our grouping of the lights. By being minimalistic with the number of groups of lights, we retain control of the lighting system and clarity for the scenes that we produce. And the very large system does not control us, we control it. So whereas in the theatre or the TV studio, each channel might be 1 or 2 kilowatts, in this environment, each channel can be at least 20 or 30 kilowatts, but the principles are precisely the same. The footlights for the Sipario curtain, for example, were 1 channel of 16 5-kilowatt Molfe floods, creating an effect that we could achieve with 2 2-kilowatt Fresnels as tab warmers in a theatre environment. So many of the segment directors had no TV or stadium experience, and we spent many a constructive hour explaining to them that 1 actor in 20 uncorrected follow spots against a Congo blue background, although looking lovely in real life, would not make for good television. However, I was able to persuade them to take some risks with colour, and compared to other Olympics, it was noted how our theatrical use of colour worked well. So obviously we could only work at night, and as most of the 1,000-strong cast were volunteers available for rehearsing mainly during the day, the actual lighting sessions were a real challenge, working as we were most of the time with no actors or indeed set. So many of the set elements, such as the moving ring structure and the Sipario, required fair weather and teams of technicians to operate, so were not available to us overnight to light. The protocol elements of speeches, flag raising and the all-important Olympic torch lighting were mainly rehearsed in daylight when the VIPs were on site. A limited number of stand-ins in the dark hours gave us some clue as what we would see on the night. I think we had 4 people to walk the parade of 2,500 athletes. So this really was an exercise in intuitive lighting programming, as we never saw a single scene with all its performers, set and special effects components until the show itself. So as ever with large-scale events, the lighting designer's role involves a massive amount of politics, trying to keep producers, directors and artists' egos and expectations in line with the realities of production schedules and the technical boundaries in which we work. I would say that once the initial design was drafted on site, 90% of my time politics and 10% on the actual lighting design. The show went ahead flawlessly, and the spirit that the Italian creators had shown in their meetings really was reflected in the passion of a very moving historical event. The lighting was very well received and applauded for its theatricality and colour, and I became the first British lighting designer to have lit an Olympic opening ceremony. 2 weeks later, we performed the closing ceremony, highlighted for me by blind tenor Andrea Bocelli and 500 young women in bridal gowns carrying illuminated lilies. And then finally, we illuminated the opening ceremony of the Paralympics. Although this event was not covered by anywhere near as many countries than the previous ceremonies, it proved to be one of the most moving evenings that I witnessed. The show combined the sporting challenges of Olympic events with the personal challenges of the disabled athletes taking part. And for me, this most clearly demonstrated the nature of the Olympic spirit. I've been very fortunate in having been invited to light some fantastic events over the years, not least of which was my invitation to light the 2012 Handover to London during the closing ceremonies of the Olympic and Paralympic Games in Beijing in 2008. So my task here was to illuminate the 8-minute handover sequence which formed part of the closing ceremonies using the stadium lighting rig designed by my Chinese colleague, Mr. Xia Zhaolin. The system available to me consisted of some 2,500 Martin, Claypaky and Vari-Light moving heads and 24 follow spots. So in order to circumnavigate the inevitable politics of staging our London event on Chinese territory, I travelled to Beijing during the year before the ceremonies to form a relationship with the Chinese lighting team and to offer my advice from my Olympic experience and my knowledge of visualization techniques and lighting for HD TV. This picture of myself and Mr. Xia demonstrates the art of allowing our host to save face by inviting him to stand one step up for the photo. I'm quite tall. He proved to be a great friend and a very talented lighting designer, as those of us who remember the opening and closing ceremonies will most surely agree. Now, although we'd established a good working relationship with the lighting department, the rest of the UK production team suffered from lack of information and the time necessary to work to the professional level to which they aspired and were accustomed. The Chinese wanted to keep everything as confidential as possible, which one could understand. But dovetailing our show into theirs obviously relied on a certain level of knowledge as to what they were up to. So we were given a 2-hour lighting session in which to create our cues. And I prepared a minimal list of 8 cues and a series of simple renderings to illustrate the style of the different looks in WYSIWYG. I also created a comprehensive list of follow spot cues and plans of which spot picked up what and where. Although the 3 operators and spot caller did not speak English, another Chinese colleague who I'd met whilst lecturing in China about my Turin experiences did, and was Mr. Xia's assistant and yet another route into their world. So the object was to illuminate the London bus as it travelled around the stadium, dramatise the transformation of the bus, and ensure that the images of the stars performing in our sequence were shown in the best light to the world's TV audiences and press. It's often unrecognised that as lighting designers, we are the directors of photography, not only for billions of TV viewers, but for every image seen in newspapers or on the web around the globe. Therefore, it pays to get the lighting of the money perfect at least. The next challenge we were presented with is unique to stadium work and possibly the most difficult situation in which a lighting designer can find themselves. So after the inevitable changes to our show and rehearsals, which were being held at the only private airfield in China, which was closed as no one was allowed to overfly Beijing during the Olympics, we requested a return to the stadium to update the lighting programme. So I was invited to the stadium at 11 p.m. on the Saturday before the closing ceremony and given 1 whole hour to work with the programmers. Now, unfortunately, they were preparing the pitch for a soccer final, and we were not allowed to turn off the stadium lighting. So this became an exercise in intuitive lighting design, as if I took control of all 2,500 moving lights and moved the fader up and down, there was no visible effect on the pitch at all. In the end, we'd done as much homework as possible and tried to realise our aspirations with humility and wit. And although the dress rehearsal was rained off, I felt quite confident as I arrived on the night to call the show. During the video clip before our sequence, I said very clearly to my Chinese friends through my English-speaking colleague, "Stand by Q1." Q1 was promptly executed rather prematurely, and I gave no more standbys that night. The show was very well received by my client and attracted a great deal of interest, mostly positive, in the UK press. We had a week's rest and returned to prepare the London bus Part 2 for the Paralympics. So this was the first time that the handover ceremonies of the Olympics and the Paralympics had shared a creative theme. The idea being that the bus transformed into its new Paralympic livery and set off on the journey home to London. So again, we negotiated 1.5 hours programming time to make a few alterations to the original lighting states, and I arrived with more prints of coulisses and pictures of the spot cues required for our final show. Unfortunately, the Chinese programmers had tidied up their desks and wiped all our previous cues. So I started at 10:30 p.m. to recreate everything from scratch before our midnight deadline, when they were to dress rehearse their own ceremony. Imagine the pressure here with every single Chinese creative and the whole ensemble of performers filling the stadium, waiting a little impatiently for the London lighting bloke to leave them in peace. So once again, out at the airfield, our own dress rehearsal was completely rained off. And though it was a known fact that the clouds over Beijing were seeded with silver nitrate at this very time to keep the skies clear 2 days later for the ceremonies, I seemed to be alone in my suspicion that we were being deliberately targeted with some very English weather. Although our hosts were never overtly obstructive, there was a definite feeling that London were not the most welcome of guests. Now, this was possibly due to the comments of certain British politicians who referred to the Chinese security team accompanying the Olympic torch in the UK as thugs, and it was rumours had them searched at Heathrow. So during our final production meeting, it became my turn to comment on the forthcoming Paralympic closing ceremony and our last performance. Once again, our bums are firmly in the hands of our Chinese friends, and it remains to be seen whether there will be a final parting of the cheeks before our final parting of the ways. Paranoia? Judge for yourselves. During the dress rehearsal of the Chinese closing ceremony, immediately prior to our sequence, there came 5 young ladies scattering handfuls of plastic autumnal leaves from baskets. How lovely. And a few hundred leaves caused us no problems. During the actual show, we experienced a 4-minute drop of over 5 million leaves all around the stadium, which completely covered everything, including the bus track and our performance area. You can clearly see the tracks of the bus as it ploughed through the leaf drift. Unfortunately, the air intakes were not completely clogged, and the area where our stage management had desperately brushed away as many shiny plastic leaves as possible, as to dance on them and do head spins, was like performing on ice. We also discovered afterwards that the leaves were not flame-proof. So imagine performing that particular trick prior to setting off many tons of fireworks immediately overhead, anywhere else. We walked away from our final performance with a huge sigh of relief and the feeling of a job well done. We'd introduced into a very impressive, though extremely regimented Chinese display, an element of fun and youthful energy. And I, for one, thoroughly enjoyed the challenge and surreality of working in this amazing country with these entertaining and hospitable people. So my next greatest show on earth was 2 years later in 2014 in Sochi. Here I was invited to light the Paralympic opening and closing ceremonies with a rig inherited from the great Al Gurdon, who designed the Olympic ceremonies a few weeks earlier. The ceremonies were produced by BWS, with the opening ceremony directed by Daniele Finzi-Pasca and the closing by Lida Castelli, with the field of play content being created for both events by Cosmo. Now, to say politics influence our work here would be a massive understatement. The fear of failure on the faces of those creative executives given responsibility by Mr. Putin to showcase his country was very apparent. This picture belies the fact that we spent more time ensuring there were no shadows in the VIP box across any VIP faces than we did on any of the other massive segments of the ceremony itself. So the enormous LED forest was originally solely for the Paralympics, but because they paid for it, it was placed into the Olympic closing ceremony at the 11th hour, much to the chagrin of those building it, who had 2 weeks lopped off their build time, and also to Al Gurdon, as this massive array obstructed a good number of his lights, including those he'd rigged for the all-important VIP balcony. The UV sequence of flying Russian birds was so liked by one executive that it moved around within the show, seemingly dependent on which bits he found boring that day. So this posed a bit of a challenge for the motion control team, who had other small things to fly. During the ship sequence, our creative team was debating what content to project onto the field of play. Should it be breaking ice flows or sea waves or what? I suggested that we have no content whatsoever, and used a projection system to create one bright source, as though from the moon. The content guy said, "You can't do that." It was completely counterintuitive to them, but that is what we did, and it was very effective, as you can see. Our events, especially if they involve projection, require a lot more delicate control, and for events like Sochi, even though the broadcast company was excellent, they were more used to filming sports events, so we still employ our own vision engineers who better understand our work. The other main challenge we face is that we need to keep the same camera settings or close to throughout the broadcast, which means that light levels for the protocol sequences are relatively lower than other ceremonies without projection. It is down to the lighting designer to explain to the IOC and IPC members that whilst their important sequences might look a little dark and grey in the stadium, to the live audience, for the 2 or 3 billion viewers worldwide, they look great. So again, politics rather than design. So as is so often the case with stadium ceremonies, once we decided to use projection on the field of play, we turned off the stadium sports lighting system and PRG installed our 2,500 moving lights to give us theatrical control of the performance environment. We were also able to take control of the LED architectural lighting in the roof, which was an additional valuable lighting effect. Now, unfortunately, not all technical aspects ran smoothly. And when one of the rings failed to open in the opening ceremony, we around the world saw it happen and were subsequently amazed at the humour allowed by the Russians when our choreographers mimicked the failure in the closing ceremony as a bit of fun. Not quite as amazed as the Russian viewing public, who had not seen the initial ring failure as it was hidden by the national broadcasters who cut to the dress rehearsal tape where it had worked. All looks fine to me. Last but no means least, let us move on to the Rio Summer Olympics opening and closing ceremonies. So in October of 2015, I was invited by Marko Balic, who was executive producer on the Rio ceremonies for Ceremonias Cariocas 2016, to travel to Rio to meet with Abel Gomez and his creative team. Andrusha, Daniela and Fernando, director of City of God. If you want to know more about Rio, watch that film. The venue for ceremonies was to be the Maracana Stadium. Famous as a World Cup soccer arena, this history would cause us real issues in the closing ceremony, as we could not have any dress rehearsal whatsoever in the stadium because of the soccer finals. Now, due to the budget for the events being around 1/3 of the cost of London 2012, what we lacked in expensive scenery and effects, once again, we had to make up with lighting and projection. The projection was designed by Patrice Bouquenot with ETC France, and the system was supplied by Creative Technology. The stadium was quite shallow, so the projection angle was unusually oblique, which led to lineup challenges and some very long shadows of anything appearing on our performance screen. Also, the pitch was not flat, but convex as it rose higher in the centre for drainage purposes. So we often speak of lighting and projection having to be carefully balanced to enhance each other, but the main impact on both departments in the early stages is the need to share dark time. So this has to be carefully and considerately scheduled. So a few words about my lighting design for the opening ceremony, which was supplied by Italian rental company Agora. To give an idea of scale, this A0 drawing scale was 1 to 300. There were 4 main layers to the design, starting in the roof and the outer trusses. The outer trusses ran all around the stadium and lit the roof and provided most of the key lighting on the field of play. The next layer of light came from the inner trusses on the roof edge, which provided key light for Box City, audience and VIP box lighting, and a steeper angle for isolated events on the field of play, whilst minimising shadows on the projection. We also had some architectural lighting in the roof, which after much repairing gave us RGB control, but only on 3 channels for the entire stadium. Not quite like what we achieved in Sochi. We had a further layer of light on the stadium circle front around halfway up the seating blocks, which is a very useful angle for camera candy effects. Finally, we had our floor lights arrayed around the projection area and shuttered or barn door to light performers and not the floor, to lift them out of their projected world. Space was at a premium because of the amount of performers charging around the place, so I placed the lights around the sound equipment like small fish protected by a tropical reef. In the lighting control room, the front row went to our programmers with Andy Voller at the far end, handling effects and architectural lighting with a PRG V676, Ross Williams Centre looking after key and foot lighting and the audience with a whole hog 4, and Brazilian Paulinho Lebrão on a Grande May 2 full-size controlling Box City. So behind them at the far end, we had lighting TV director Nick Collier, who liaised with our excellent vision engineer Luke Chantrell and looked after our vision monitoring and recording. Then Chris Henry, our spot captain, who through an interpreter called the 20 follow spots and balanced their output and colour correction. And alongside me, my ever-smiling Brazilian Associate LD, Joyce Drummond. To my right and guarding the portal to our domain was my wife and business partner, Jenny, our team logistics and welfare manager, who made sure we all got fed and watered throughout the long dark nights when catering was safely tucked up in bed. As always, my view of the real world was limited, but I had a full view of the electronic world with a comprehensive array of monitoring to the 30 or so cameras and my comms panel to my operators and our directors and production. Each of our desks had a full WYSIWYG system, which is vital on this scale of event for programming when certain parts of the rig might be offline or not visible. This can be due to weather, daylight, rigging issues, or power failure when the generator diesel is sitting in another part of Rio. WYSIWYG also played its part during the show, as I modelled each operator his own part of the rig in the stadium, so everyone could monitor their own fixtures, even if they could not physically see them. Okay, let's have a quick look at some of the images from the opening ceremony. So the challenge in the opening sequence was to make performers in silver suits carrying silver pillows on a white background visible to camera. The solution we found was to keep the lighting oblique and create shadows under the pillows to give them some form of relief. At the end of the welcome sequence, Christophe Bertineau and Group F opened fire and made some Rio words which looked great but had to be filmed from the correct direction to make the word make sense on TV. So after a short protocol moment for the national anthem, we moved on to the next artistic segment, Pinderama. So this was our recognition of the indigenous people of Brazil, and actual tribesmen and women performed with one of our few pieces of scenery, a large elasticated net, which raised and became a vertical projection surface. The elastic screen was pulled into natural shapes. This sequence was choreographed by Deborah Coker, who did an amazing job, but was always fine-tuning her work during the day. So one night, after a day of rehearsals, the tribesfolk formed 4 groups, which was in a tightly focused sequence, which before, I was convinced, there had been only 3. She swore she'd not changed the grouping, but we showed her our recording grab from the night before. Record everything. The elastics then form man-made shapes, and we moved from green light to warm white to reflect this all, and also man's use of fire. Next came the arrival of the several peoples who make up modern Brazil. This was a delicate balance of projected pathways and lighting. Spot Captain Chris Henry and her team did a great job lighting the object so that the beams followed or were lost in the direction of the projected paths. Ross Williams' delicate foot lighting added to the visibility on camera of the many performers moving through the projection. You can see the gobo crosslight from the floor that delicately lit the banners, and the pools of light we introduced without wiping out the projected image. So next, Metropolis and the introduction to the massive scenic and technical element of Box City. I hope you all remember this sequence, which was really effective, showing the buildings apparently ground to the ground, and our parkour runners jumping from roof to roof. They finally arrive at the massive Box City set piece, which reflected the favelas. Here's the real thing as seen from behind our control room. So then a sequence with Santos Dumont, whom Brazilians claim made the first true takeoff and landing flight before the Wright brothers. Apparently Santos had another claim to fame when he asked his friend Cartier to adapt his fob watch to be strapped to his arm during his flights, and thus invented the first wristwatch. So next came the pop sequence, starting with a tribute to Tom Jobin, who wrote The Girl from Ipanema. So the front of Box City had several different scenic panels mounted as roller blinds, and the surface changed to create the image of Tom as his actual son played the song on the piano. Behind Box City, we lifted the sight lights well off the floor, as with so many performers backstage, shadows appearing on our sight were almost guaranteed otherwise. Our Brazilian programmer Paulinho worked closely with the choreographer and the projection to create a fantastic and complex sequence by importing the video of the effects animations directly into the Grand MA2. Next, a great sequence with a breakdancer spinning on projection as though it was underneath a giant glass surface. Now, I had 4 spots on the floor to pick up performers atop of the projections without leaving any light or shadow in the images. Unfortunately, this technique does not work so well when the performer spends most of his time spinning on his head. The sequence ended with the really colourful Tremi Tremi. Now, no matter what fantastic artistic sequences we create, next came the most important part of any opening ceremony. During the athletes' parade, the plan was to have RGB effects bringing out different images painted on the Box City parade skins. Unfortunately, this did not work as well as planned when one of the creatives decided they did not like the colour red. Green and blue it was then. Each athlete was given a seed on entry, and these seeds were placed in receptacles on some mirrored scenic elements that would later be planted in a new forest to be grown on the site of the Olympic Park. These mirrored boxes were then formed into the Olympic ring shape. The marshals almost found their marks. They then transformed into trees, and my real concern here was that we had no overhead light to get rid of the shadows that would muddy the image when the box is opened to reveal trees that form the ring shapes. The visual, as ever, shows a rather unrealistic, clearer picture. Now, fortunately, the light from the pyro at the top of the sequence filled the gaps, and we got a good overhead broadcast picture of the tree rings. Planned, of course. The next protocol segment presented another unique challenge. To clear the field of play projection, the protocol stage was very close to the audience behind it, and the Brazilian public had little respect for their president. I think there were 3 changes of office whilst we were there. We were therefore requested to keep light off the audience, who were prone to making obscene gestures, which would then be seen quite clearly by 3.5 billion people around the world. The stage was so close to the seating that we could not keep the background dark, but counterintuitively, we increased the light levels, which increased the depth of field of the cameras, allowing the focus to blur any hand gestures to an acceptable level. So next, the dove sequence, which is a tradition now adapted to not include real doves since Athens, when some of them were fried as they flew into the Olympic cauldron. And so we moved into the final sequence before the lighting of the cauldron. The amount of action to light here really stretched our equipment limitations. And finally, the much anticipated lighting of the cauldron. This was very much the Green Olympics, and so the cauldron design was a closely guarded secret. In place of the massive bowls of fire we normally have, the bowl was relatively small and sat in front of the beautiful kinetic mirror sculpture by British artist Anthony Howe. The advantage for me here was that historically the cauldron throws out so much light that it illuminates the stadium all on its own. But I was able to create something a little more magical in this darker environment. Here I used the pin spot ability of our mainly clay packy fixtures, and due to the high standard of optics, I was able to emulate the reflected shafts of light from the mirrors around the stadium. Once again enhanced by the smoke from Christoph's fireworks. Actually, quite a lot of smoke. This was one of my favourite images, the view from the adjacent favela. Now, I think we just have time to cover the Rio closing ceremony, which became known amongst our production team as the greatest busk on earth. This topic is slightly unusual in that during and after the Olympics, the focus of attention is very much on the opening ceremony, whereas the closing, as in the ceremony's preparations, is very much in second place. So why did we name the closing ceremony as the greatest busk on earth? The answer lies in the deal that was made between the Brazilian Organising Committee and the IOC when it was put forward that the Games in 2016 will be staged in the city of Rio. The IOC, I believe, made it a condition that the soccer final should be held in the iconic Maracana Stadium. And as this is where the ceremonies were to be staged, this had a major and unique impact on our work. For the first time in recent history, certainly since Torino in 2006, the closing ceremony was to be performed without any form of rehearsals in the stadium itself. So we were tasked with creating the lighting for an event to be viewed by an estimated 3 billion people, without any scenery, performers, props or stage, and on a highly technical show, with mass choreography and large-scale projection, no dress rehearsal whatsoever. What could possibly go wrong? Once the opening ceremony had been well rehearsed and performed, it was time to take a break whilst the stadium was prepared for the Olympic soccer finals. We had a new creative team headed by Queen of Carnival, Rosella Magalhães, and choreographed by choreo chart superstar Bryn Walters and his team. The iconic Box City was history, and indeed the whole of the opening ceremony scenery, field of play cover and floor lighting and sound had been removed during the transformation of our venue back to a soccer stadium, and the pitch had even been re-turfed for the soccer finals. The athletes were to be seated around the field of play, and we had a new performance and protocol stage. Even the fantastic cauldron sculpture had been moved to the other end of the stadium. Also in the changeover, the guys from our rental company Agora had re-rigged to my closing ceremony lighting design, which became 360 degrees after the removal of the massive Box City set at the southern end of the stadium. As for the opening ceremony, we were to combine light and projection and focus accurately onto the performers, but with absolutely no rehearsal or focus sessions with any cast. How did we do this? So the real heroes were mass choreographer Bryn Walters and Claire Terry and their team, who produced accurate choreo charts exactly mirroring that which they rehearsed with the performers in the adjacent marked out car park. So once the evening's game had finished, our technical team, captained by James Lee, and having negotiated permission to actually walk on the grass, covered the pitch with 4 large sheets of parachute silk. So we then projected the choreo chart onto this surface at exactly the right scale, and then focused our lights onto the accurate positions marked on the projected chart for each scene. Each evening brought different challenges, such as finding the electricians to switch off the stadium lights and the soccer game after the soccer games. So one evening I was informed by the ops team that this evening's delay was down to an English TV lighting guy who would not let them turn the floodlighting off. So once again I set off to do battle on my programmer's behalf, wrongly believing that I was the only English LD in the stadium. Standing on the pitch with a coven of stadium electricians was my colleague Mike Gorman, who had been tasked by the Olympic Broadcasting Service to sort out the broadcast lighting for the soccer matches. When the stadium was originally built, all the important folks sat in the East Stand, so to save money, most of the stadium lighting had been placed on that side to mainly front light the games. When the Olympic Circus hove into view, the VIP seating stand for the ceremonies, and hence the evening soccer games, had been placed on the west side. So to compensate for this, Mike was turning off strategic fixtures so the whole pitch was not quite so heavily backlit. He mastered his issues, and once again we sat down to our exercise of faith and criminal optimism. There is no doubt in my mind that along with Parachute, Silt and WYSIWYG, we would not have come anywhere close to the standard of lighting that we achieved in the closing ceremony. Anyway, back to the task in hand, and we continued our sojourn into the early hours, focusing on each chart, which then revealed itself in the show. After chart, after chart. So we were as well prepared as circumstances could possibly allow, and I witnessed the bizarre spectacle of a dress rehearsal being performed in daylight in a car park next to the stadium. There's something most surreal to see 1,000 or so performers dancing in complete silence as they hear the music and placement instructions through in-ear monitoring. Anyway, after a few inevitable tweaks to our lighting overnight and our homework done, we were set to go. I knew we'd also need a large chunk of luck to pull this off. But as Lee Trevino is reported to have said when asked if golf was just luck, I guess so, but it seems the more I practice, the luckier I get. We've been very lucky with the weather up to now, but on the day of the show, we had a biblical storm. You can see the front light bouncing quite clearly in the video with the wind. The wind was strong enough to blow away some of the dimmer room walls on the roof and had all the trussing and PA swaying quite alarmingly. Our safety teams were monitoring this closely, and we actually came very close to the stadium being evacuated. But once again, cool heads in our ops team held steady, and we opened Pandora's box as each sequence unfolded before us, our audience, and our 3 billion viewers. And that's the video, please. So you can see the empty seats around the field of play, which were where the athletes would sit as they entered during their parade. Unfortunately, there were not enough black chairs available in Rio, so we had a rather obvious empty whites around for half of our show. The bad weather also grounded our 2 camera helicopters for the overhead shot of the stadium and a live image of Christ the Redeemer. So when colour matching the Christ formation to the floodlighting on the real object, I told Bryn that the statue might be shrouded in clouds, so we'd best pre-shoot it. It never crossed our minds that the helicopter taking the shot might not even be able to fly. So on the night, we were rewarded with the sight of our nightly labours having really paid off, with the lighting matching the choreography seamlessly. The start of the Carmen Miranda sequence was lit by follow spots at floor level to keep her light off the projection beneath her. Then as the projection built, we added front and back light. I'm still amazed by the accuracy we achieved with our focusing. With the rain, you can see the water spraying up from the dance floor. So aside from nearly drowning our show, the rain did make some moments look more effective. So by now we'd filled the white chair void with our athletes, and I'll never forget the look on the face of one of the groundsmen who was painting the centre pitch on the night that we created this rather dynamic effect. So with the strong winds, it looked at one point during the rather beautiful cauldron extinguishing sequence that the singer beneath the voluminous waterfall effect would be the only dry person in the house, as the water seemed to blow everywhere but down onto her. The flame was extinguished, and we look forward to seeing it next in Tokyo, hopefully next year. So just got a minute. This unlikely couple are a very popular TV presenter duo, he being a street cleaner and she being the richest model in Brazil. The grand finale was for carnival time, and we had to have a huge float. So even with the small portal of the stadium, which are designed to allow access for at best a large tractor, I'd lobbied our carnival queen Rosa to weave her magic, and there it was. One intrepid helicopter pilot did finally manage to get airborne and broadcast the final fireworks shots. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Durham. That was absolutely fascinating, absolutely stunning, fantastic presentation. It's great to see sort of behind the scenes, especially the politics, and even some of the politics that you managed to solve by careful and selective lighting. We've got literally 5 minutes, and there's quite a lot of questions in. There's one from Matt Waring, editor of Arc Magazine, and I just wanted to, I'll put that to you. He's asked, did you find that there's a pressure or a need to go bigger and better with each of your ceremonies?
Yeah, I think Beijing was the sort of the ultimate in that respect. We never did find out how much they'd spent. In Rio, we had a lot of financial issues. The real was devalued several times whilst we were out there. And I think it was nice to prove that you didn't have to have billions to produce an effective show.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. Do you think you'd find it easier to have a smaller budget with total freedom, or was it easier to have such a large budget and then all those sort of political extra constraints?
Hey, I'm a lighting designer. I've never been given too much money. So the more the merrier as far as I'm concerned.
Absolutely. How long are you actually based in each country, leading up to an event and there obviously for the event, but beforehand?
It depends on the political stability and the IOC. So in Turin, we had 4 years traveling out to the stadium there and looking at having meetings. That's 4 years' work. And in Rio, it was 6 months. And that's based purely on them making the final decision on the artistic teams and budgets.
And just one,
so it varies massively.
One sort of final question, I guess, is you've sort of mentioned so many different people, vision engineers, motion controllers, programmers. But then when you see the sort of the shots in the control box, it's quite a few of you. How many are actually in your team?
Including the follow spot operators and the technicians, obviously, rather than the creative side, there's around 40 or 50 people working on to realize our shows. And the shows we produce are only as good as them. So a big thank you to all our crews all around the world. And we always try and use locals where we can as well, to leave a legacy of knowledge when the Olympic circus moves on. And we've got some great friends that we've made in Rio and Sochi and around the world.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Durham. What a fantastic way to open our show, your live stream. That was such a brilliant presentation. Really appreciate you doing this for us. Thank you very much.
My absolute pleasure, and thanks for the invitation, and have a great conference.